Welcome, my young apprentice, to this magical seat of learning, to this enchanted place of enlightenment and precious knowledge. But remember always that knowledge without imagination is nothing. Around the world, when Henry VIII was King of England, there were 3 different ways to make strong swords. In Europe, the swordsmiths in Milan, Toledo and Nuremberg heated up small balls of pure iron made in Sweden and bashed them together into the right shape. Then they baked their swords in powdered charcoal before plunging them into cold water to harden their edges. In Persia, the smiths continued the earliest techniques of the Iron Age, heating ore and charcoal in a clay furnace until the iron fused. This made pure iron, which they then melted with charcoal to make a cake of hard iron that they beat out 50 times to make a short sword. The swords had a spotty appearance, but were very strong. Meanwhile, the Japanese smiths created a mix of soft and hard iron, which was piled up, beaten and folded many times, like making puff pastry. You can see where the hard and soft layers meet in a samurai sword in the patterns of swirling lines on their surface. All 3 of these early smiths thought that the patterns on their blades created their strength. But in fact, it's not the patterns, but the way the atoms are arranged within the metal that creates strength. With today's science, we can see that the swordsmiths were changing the balance of iron and carbon in their metal. When it's dug out of the ground, iron ore contains iron and oxygen atoms. Burning charcoal releases carbon monoxide, which attracts the oxygen out of the iron ore, leaving behind pure, soft iron. But if a small amount of carbon is added, the metal becomes stronger but more brittle. Johannes Kepler, the astronomer, was the first person to try to explain how atoms form up into metals. He guessed that if matter was made up of spheres, which we now call atoms, they would pack together as hexagons. He was right. But we didn't get the proof until here in Cambridge in 1913, William Bragg and his dad, William Bragg, looked at how X-rays are diffracted by crystals. They won the Nobel Prize for showing how atoms in metals form up in regular patterns. The younger William then invented a machine to explain the idea. His machine blows perfectly regular soap bubbles to form floating rafts. The bubbles represent atoms, and they form up in hexagonal patterns, just as Kepler predicted. But if you look closely, the packing isn't perfect, and that's why metal can change shape. Another Cambridge scientist, Geoffrey Taylor, showed that they do this line by line at imperfections which he called dislocations. Metals change shape when they're forged because dislocations allow the atoms to rearrange. If you want a strong sword or a really good spring, you have to make it difficult for the dislocations to move. And that's exactly what happens if you add carbon to iron. The carbon makes small, hard spots in the regular lattice of atoms. Too little carbon, and the dislocations move easily, so the metal's soft. Too much carbon, and the dislocations can hardly move, so the metal is hard but brittle. All 3 of the swordsmiths in Henry VIII's day had found ways to get just the right amount of carbon. They thought they were making mystical patterns to make their swords strong. In fact, The patterns showed how the carbon atoms were mixed into the iron, and it's the carbon that gave the swords their strength. So they were doing the right thing. They just didn't have the right explanation. The swordsmiths started from lumps of metal, but their neighbours, the armourers, needed to start with flat sheets. Plate armour was designed for war, sport or parade. And although we don't wear armour today, we use cars for many of the same reasons. And as we make 100 million cars per year, we need a lot of flat sheets of metal. If you squeeze a cube of plasticine between your fingers, you can feel it moving. It spreads under your skin and the material bulges outwards. Like metal, the piece of plasticine keeps the same volume, so as you make it flatter in one direction, it spreads out in another, and that's the challenge. The blacksmith's main weapon is his hammer. If he has a small piece of metal, he just whacks it flat on his anvil. So if you want a flat sheet, you just need a bigger, flatter hammer. And men love competing to have the biggest hammer. Today, the biggest hammer of them all is to be found back in China. But even this gigantic press can only flatten a piece of steel about 1 meter across, and that's because of friction. If you squeeze the plasticine cube between dry fingers, or squash a gummy bear in a press, it bulges out in the middle, but friction stops the top and bottom from spreading out. If we zoom in to where two dry metal parts touch, their surfaces would look rough. They actually touch only where a few peaks meet. If we wanted to slide one surface over the other, we'd need to apply a force to break these tiny welds. That force is what creates friction, and it builds up over the area of contact, so even under a massive press, friction stops the metal spreading and flattening. You can reduce friction by using something slippery to stop the surfaces from joining. Factories today mainly use oil. If the world's biggest hammer can only flatten 1 meter discs, it's going to be hard work to make an oil tanker. Fortunately though, in between painting the Mona Lisa and inventing the helicopter, Leonardo da Vinci invented the rolling mill. Leonardo's invention was brilliant because it uses friction to help rather than letting it be a problem. When the metal, or pasta, comes into a rolling mill, friction pulls it forwards because the roll is going faster than the metal. The metal is then squeezed between the rolls and shoots out the other side. Unlike the giant hammer in China, the length of contact between the roll and the metal is very short, so friction can't build up to stop the metal spreading forwards. Today's biggest mills roll out 6-meter wide plates of steel to make ships, but we can also roll wafer-thin cooking foil and hardened sheets that we cut out with lasers to make throwing knives. We still can't make metal absolutely uniform, but I bet Leonardo da Vinci could have sorted it out. Folding's easy. It's hard to pull sheets or wires along their length, but bending metal, like making a horseshoe, is easier. The thinner the metal, the easier it is to bend. So we make lots of metal objects by folding and joining: biscuit boxes, ladders, and even the famous Land Rover Defender. However, if you fold metal too tightly, it tears. When it's made, metal always has small imperfections. We've seen dislocations already, but all metals also have very small bubbles called voids. On the inside of a bend, these voids get squashed, which is not a problem, but on the outside, they're stretched and tend to join up, so eventually they tear. It turns out that when you're shaping a sheet of metal, you're always trying to tread a path between the two dangers of tearing and wrinkling. Tutankhamun was buried with 2 trumpets which had been made by rolling up flat sheets of silver. But they were very short and could play just 1 note each. To make more notes, trumpet smiths made longer instruments until eventually they had to be curled up. But one of the most amazing achievements of early metal forming is the Celtic invention of the carnix. An ornamental battle horn designed to terrify the enemy, it also made wonderful sounds. We're told that after one battle, when the captured warriors heard it play, they died in ecstasy. If 2,000 years ago they could make cups, trumpets and cornices, you might wonder what we have achieved since. Well, we've become really good at shaping metal quickly. Around 1800, we invented the double-action press. The first action grips the edges of a piece of sheet to stop it wrinkling, but not too tightly so it doesn't tear. The second action punches down the middle to make whatever shape we want. It might take a skilled sawsmith days to flatten a circular saw, but we can turn flat discs of metal into drinks cans at a rate of 10 every second. Metal's shiny, and the more you polish it, the shinier it gets. We like things that shine. We know that the precious metals we have are precious because they're so shiny. We also like looking at ourselves, and unless we happen to have a convenient pool of mercury, the best mirrors are shiny, polished metal. Most mirrors today are actually polished aluminium foil, just like the foil you use to roast the Sunday chicken, but stuck on the back of a piece of glass so that the shine doesn't wear off. When we looked at friction earlier, we saw that all surfaces are actually rough. Well, polishing, of course, makes them less rough. We do this by rubbing the metal with ever smoother abrasive stones or sandpaper, which knock off the peaks of roughness. The final stages use something which is itself very smooth, like buffalo skin, from which we get the word buffing. As well as creating a reflective shine, grinding and polishing is also used to create sharp edges. Japanese swords are polished to perfection, so we can see the patterns that show how they were made. And they're also honed to such a sharp edge that they can cut a fine silk handkerchief with one stroke. For a short time in 18th century England, the town of Woodstock near Oxford became the centre of a trade in cut steel jewellery, with the heads of old horseshoe nails polished to such a perfect surface that they reflected light just as well as diamonds and became even more valuable. As well as making shiny surfaces, we also decorate metal by embossing it. Church brasses, the commemorative plaques of our ancestors, are flat sheets of brass with letters and pictures hammered into them with fine punches. The silver platters and gold trophies we award to our sporting champions are decorated with fine hammering, knocking out patterns and symbols of triumph. One of the earliest trophies is the Gundestrup cauldron, found in Denmark and probably made around 2,000 years ago. The cauldron is decorated on the inside and outside with scenes of terror, triumph and war. There's even a picture of a procession of carnix players. And if we can shape metal, polish it and decorate it, then we can also use it for comedy. The armourers of Henry VIII's time would occasionally show off their technique by adding horns, wavy hair, spectacles or moustaches to their tournament helmets. If an opponent wasn't killed by the strike of a sword or the sound of a carnix, perhaps he might just die of laughter instead. Making steel from iron ore depended on charcoal, which is made from wood, and we were running out of trees. Abraham Darby, whose family built the iron bridge across the River Severn in Shropshire, made the first step towards a solution. He learned to bake coal into coke, and using coke, the Darby's blast furnaces soon poured out great streams of liquid iron. But their liquid iron absorbed too much carbon from the coke, so it was brittle. It could be cast in moulds, which is how the components of the bridge were made, but could not be forged. 100 years later, Henry Bessemer found that blasting air through the liquid iron reduced the amount of carbon in it to make it more malleable, and this, combined with James Watt's steam engine, realized the Industrial Revolution. Our appetite for metal grew and grew. George Stephenson invented the steam locomotive, and soon Britain had national rail tracks, allowing more people than ever before to move around the country. Isambard Kingdom Brunel used steel to make ships, so we could trade the products of Britain's new factories around the world. In the 19th century, we started to develop new metals, aluminium, titanium, magnesium, that would allow us to make aeroplanes and space rockets. And we had so much steel, we could make gigantic oil tankers, bigger cars, more food cans, and enormous skyscrapers. And as we made new metal ever faster, we also learned how to shape it faster. But by the 19th century, we could use steam engines to pull ever stronger metal ever more rapidly into wires. We started to make extremely strong wires for the sonorous springs of metal-framed pianos and harps. We learned to join wires into meshes that could be bent into shape to make reinforcement for concrete buildings or fast-moving shopping trolleys. Soon, we could squeeze out seamless tubes, shape seamless rings, forge small couplings, and we had everything we needed to invent the bicycle, which is a treasury of the techniques of metal forming. Every component has been made in a different way, and it's taken thousands upon thousands of inventors to work out how to make all of the different pieces. It seems that there's nothing we can't do with metal. And now we make 200 kilograms of steel every year for every person living on the planet, more than 3 times our combined average body weight. But just like when we ran out of trees, we're facing a new problem. Making steel and aluminium causes 1/4 of the carbon emissions released by all of the world's industries. And as everyone these days understands, this is causing rapid global warming. After so many centuries of development, metal processing is so efficient it can't be improved much further. So in the future, we're just going to have to make less metal. And that's one of the reasons we need to bring lots of inventive people together to think about shaping metal better. It's over 5,000 years since we started to use metal. Before we had any science, we'd worked out how to make beakers out of gold, shirts out of chainmail, and helmets with curly horns. With today's science, we've come a long way to understanding how atoms pack together in crystals and slide across each other to allow metal to change shape, how friction occurs and can be relieved by lubrication, how forming metal requires treading a path between the limits of wrinkling and tearing. But the context keeps changing. Making metal is a big cause of greenhouse gas emissions, so now we have to find ways to continue living as well as we do today while making much better use of less metal. Metal today is cheap, so we use it wastefully. About a quarter of the metal made each year is cut off and wasted when products are manufactured, and most products containing metal still use a third more than they actually need. We could live just as well with half the amount of metal, if only we could learn how to shape it better.